Welcome. This is Dr. Owen Anderson, and I want to talk about how to interpret scripture and an example of that, a good example that comes up, which will test our ability. And what we're doing in interpreting, we're asking, what does something mean? If there is a self-contradiction, then it has no meaning. But people often think of this more like, if it contradicts some other thing I think, then it just leave there, right? So that's not the same as a contradiction. In this video, what we're looking at just is, are there direct contradictions in a text? And some texts do have direct contradictions and some don't. When we're reading something, this is our first level of giving a reading. So consider Genesis 3:22. How can we give meaning to this? The context is Genesis 1. So we can't simply take one verse out of the context in which it occurs. So here's the verse. After they sinned, God says, "The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever." So how can we take this to mean? What does it mean to be like one of us? What are the possible meanings here? So let's look at the meaning here. The man created not too long ago, just failed a temptation, will become an action in the future. Doesn't mean distant future, but not currently. Like one of us, a self-reference to God. Who is without beginning. So what are the possible meanings here? Well, one way that people read it is man is going to become a god. Or even you take this as present. Man already is a god. Let's take it that way. Currently is. Like one of us. Well, that would simply be false with reference to the most important thing about God, the most basic thing. You can't go from having had a beginning to not have a beginning. There's lots of things you can do, like I can go from not having a degree to getting a degree, go from not being a parent to being a parent, go from not having a cat to having a cat, but you can't go from I had a beginning and now I don't have a beginning. I mean, try to even think what the mechanism would be like. You go back in time and erase your beginning. How would you do that? So that can't be what it means. Well, it's referencing to the temptation. You will be like God. In what sense? So it can't be in that sense. The other one I didn't mention is finite. That's why I stressed just failed a temptation. God's infinite, doesn't fail things. They just did, clearly not infinite. So they didn't become infinite or eternal when they ate the fruit. You will be like God in knowing good and evil. And so the knowing there is particularly in relationship to how God knows things, making yourself the determiner of good and evil. Any way you want it, that's the way you need it. You decide. The whole of the law is do what you want. In that sense, they put themselves in the place of God. And if they continue without redemption in that condition, immortality would be a curse to them. So far from this being an example where, oh, God is keeping something good away from them, say, no, God's protecting them from something that would not be good for them. To live forever in this context would not be good. So they are restored to the tree of life at the end of history when sin's been destroyed. Then they are restored to this. And the essential sin is this. All the different ways it expresses itself in world history can be traced back to, I put myself in the place of God. So they don't become infinite or eternal. In that sense, they're not like God. They become as having put themselves in the place of God. So this is an example, one example among many of how to interpret when we come to a text. We're looking for what could this mean, not simply in light of what I personally think, or what my tradition or my culture hold to, but what is the meaning of the word God here? And could anything become God in the sense of infinite and eternal? Well, no. So it must mean some other sense. So on when you run into a direct self-contradiction, the temporal, what had a beginning became without a beginning. You know, it can't mean that. And you keep trying. So how to interpret text, really, this is not, I put up here how to interpret scripture, but what I just said is really how to approach any text. When you're reading any text, you would say, well, what does this mean? It most likely doesn't mean a direct contradiction. Scripture has a little bit different category if you think it's inspired, then it doesn't have contradictions, whereas other books might, people who do contradict themselves. But whatever you do, you're looking to see, could this be true? Or would that be more like a square circle? So how to interpret